All right, so let's start talking about the muscular system. And as you guys can imagine, the muscular system is composed of skeletal muscles. So these are all different types of skeletal muscles here, and we'll be talking about a lot of these. So skeletal muscles are part of the muscular system. But in addition to that, there are a lot of connective tissues that are also part of the skeletal system. These include things like the deep fascia, okay? All of these mesonems here, these are also connective tissue wrappings around skeletal muscles and parts of the skeletal muscles. Tendons, which connect skeletal muscles to bones and other things, are part of the muscular system, as are something we call aponeuroses, which are basically flattened tendons. So all of these components are part of the muscular system here. And I like this picture right here because this shows skeletal muscle running in all these different directions here. But take a look at all this white space in between. All right, this isn't air. It's not fluid necessarily. What it is, it's connective tissue, and it's wrapping all of these different parts of the skeletal muscles and the muscular system together. Okay, so from an anatomical perspective, skeletal muscles are individual organs that attach to and cover the bony skeleton. So here's the body wall here, and let's just take a look at these layers here. So the most superficial layer is the skin, the integument. You guys are familiar with that. The epidermis, and then the dermis below that. And then beneath that, we have, what's this layer right there? That's the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer. And as you guys remember, there's adipose tissue in here, there's areolar tissue in there, a lot of loose connective tissues. And then if we look a little bit deeper, here we have skeletal muscles. And skeletal muscles themselves can be several layers deep. So here we have a couple layers of skeletal muscle. And then this thin layer right there is something called deep fascia. And these are connective tissue coverings that wrap around the individual skeletal muscles there. And then with regards to bones, most of the bones of the body are wrapped or compartmentalized within the skeletal muscle here. So we find them wrapped by skeletal muscles, covered by skeletal muscles. Okay, so let's talk about some things that skeletal muscles do. First of all, skeletal muscles allow for movement. Here we have the biceps brachii, and when skeletal muscles contract, what they do is they pull on tendons. So here we have the bicep, and it's contracting, it's shortening, and when it does that, it pulls on tendons. So there's that tendon right there. These tendons then pull on bones. So the biceps contracts, it pulls on this tendon, and the tendon pulls on this bone. And when this occurs across a joint, like the elbow joint, then that allows movement to occur. And we'll talk more about what happens with that. Skeletal muscle contraction also generates heat. So the text here is actually a little different than on your PowerPoint. I just changed this before I did it here. So when you're answering the study question related to this, then you guys can refer to this text here. But back to the point here is that when skeletal muscles contract, they generate heat. When you exercise, your body temperature goes up. And why is that the case? The answer to that is that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is required for skeletal muscle contraction. And that's what this is showing down here. For skeletal muscles to contract, ATP is required for this process. So when ATP is used for this process, not only do skeletal muscles contract, but heat is generated as a byproduct of this reaction. So the reason that the body warms up during exercise is because the skeletal muscles are using more ATP, and so more heat is generated. Another thing that skeletal muscles do is they stabilize joints. And I guess what I should say is that the tendons that cross joints are going to stabilize joints. So here we have the knee joint. And this is an anterior view. So these are the quadriceps right here. And as you'll find out, skeletal muscles are attached to bone via tendons. So these are all tendons here. And then these are ligaments on the outside. But yeah, here we have some tendons. And there's a lot of tendons on the backside of the knee as well. So, for most joints, the tendons that cross the joint are the most important stabilizing factor. So the most important stabilizing factor for the knee joint and other joints is the tendons that cross them. And this is because the tendons are kept taut or kept tight at all times. So these tendons are tight. And because of their tightness, they stabilize the knee joint. The reason these tendons are tight is because skeletal muscles that are attached to them always have a slight bit of contraction. So the quadriceps, for instance here, even if you're not heavily using these, they always have a little bit of contraction going on, which pulls on these tendons and keeps these tendons tight. And these tight tendons crossing the joints are, again, the most important stabilizing factor for that particular joint. So if you have problems with their joint and you want to stabilize it, for instance, then what you want to do is you want to build the muscles whose tendons cross that joint. For the knee joint, for instance, work the quadriceps, work the hamstrings on the backside. Skeletal muscles also protect the more fragile internal viscera. And you guys know this already. Here's a good example. Here are all the abdominal components. And we have 4 layers of skeletal muscles that are going to protect that abdominal viscera. Because in this particular case, there's no bony cage around the abdomen. Skeletal muscles, as we'll find out, for the most part are voluntarily controlled. However, they can be involuntarily controlled. And these are a couple examples where that's the case. And here are a couple examples of involuntary control of skeletal muscles. One of these are involved in reflexes. Okay, and this is the hot stove reflex here. So for instance, you activate a nociceptor on the finger, and that sensory information is taken toward the central nervous system, and it goes to the spinal cord. Now normally what happens, is it goes up to the cerebrum, and we think about it, and then we decide a response. But with these reflexes, integration oftentimes occurs at the level of the spinal cord. So there's your integration right there. And what motor response is this integrating neuron doing? It's activating a motor neuron that travels out like so, and it activates skeletal muscle. So let's go over this again. Sensory information comes in, integration occurs, and a motor response goes directly to the skeletal muscle that's going to allow for this protective reflex. In this instance, we're withdrawing the hand. So when integration occurs anywhere besides the cerebrum, when it occurs in the spinal cord, when it occurs in the medulla, all that kind of stuff, this is involuntarily controlled. Another example of this are skeletal muscles that are involved in generating what's called respiratory or breathing rate. So here's the medulla oblongata, and we're just going over this, finishing this up in Bio 242, but the medulla oblongata sends motor neurons out, or sends signals out, and it activates motor neurons that activate these skeletal muscles that are involved in breathing, in respiration. And this is all, it's involuntarily controlled. Okay, so let's look at some gross anatomy of the skeletal muscle. Gross means, what does that mean? It means you can see it with the naked eye. Okay, so here's one skeletal muscle, and since you guys know this already, this is the femur. Okay, so could be a quadricep muscle, it could be a hamstring or whatnot, but this right here is one skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscles, well, when you look at this, here's a cross section, you can see that there's lots of individual structures within this one skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscles are divided into discrete structures that we call fascicles. So each one of these little guys is a fascicle. It's the first cross section you see when you make a cross section of a skeletal muscle. So those are all fascicles, which means this is a fascicle right there. And when you look at one fascicle, you can see there's a bunch of other structures in there. Okay, so within these fascicles are individual skeletal muscle cells. That's an individual skeletal muscle cell. That's one right there. Here they show one right there. That's an individual skeletal muscle cell. Also called a muscle fiber. Skeletal muscle cell, skeletal muscle fiber are interchangeable. So this is one skeletal muscle cell right there. And the reason this is critical, one of the reasons that you know this, is that the skeletal muscle cell, not the entire skeletal muscle, not the fascicle, but the skeletal muscle cell is the level of neuron innervation. So when neurons come in and they cause skeletal muscles to contract, they innervate the individual skeletal muscle cells. They don't come down and tell the whole skeletal muscle to contract. That doesn't happen. They have to go down to the level of the skeletal muscle cell. Now, something that's handy to know is that fascicles within a skeletal muscle run in one direction. So if we go back here, all of these fascicles, again, these are all fascicles, they all run in the same direction. So fascicles within an individual skeletal muscle run in one direction. And why this is beneficial is because it means you can grossly distinguish one skeletal muscle from another based on fascicle direction. And this is obviously a cat in the skeletal muscles of a cat. And we don't do cats in this class for some different reasons, but one of the benefits of it, one of the things I like about it, is that you can distinguish individual skeletal muscles, one skeletal muscle from another, by looking at the direction of these fascicles. So there's one skeletal muscle right there. These are all individual skeletal muscles running right here. Here's the deltoid. That's another skeletal muscle, okay? So all these skeletal muscles, the fascicles within them all run different directions, and it allows you to differentiate one skeletal muscle from another. Okay, skeletal muscle cells are long, they're striated, and they're multinucleated. So here's this muscle right here that's highlighted as the sartorius. It's involved in hip flexion. And skeletal muscle cells are long because they run the length of the entire muscle. So the sartorius here, its origin is up there on the ilium on the hip, and it comes down here and it inserts on the tibial tuberosity. So maybe this muscle is running 1.5, 2 feet long. And skeletal muscle cells run that individual length. So these skeletal muscle cells in the sartorius, for instance, may be 1.5, 2 feet long. So here we have individual skeletal muscle cells. Okay, this is the direction that they're running. And something else you can probably notice in there are these striations, these lines. And these lines are running perpendicular to the direction of the skeletal muscle cell. And they're a distinguishing feature of skeletal muscle. We also find it in cardiac muscle as well. And then if we look, a lot of this is, I'd imagine, is mitochondria, but a lot of these are also nuclei. So skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. They have lots of nuclei within one cell. And why is that the case? It has to do with their length. Basically, the sheer size, the sheer length of the skeletal muscle means that you have to have a lot of nuclei in there producing new proteins. You have a high turnover of proteins within a skeletal muscle cell because of its length, and you need lots of nuclei pumping out new proteins to replace those. Individual skeletal muscles are wrapped by deep fascia. And again, here's our skeletal muscles, and here's our deep fascia that wraps each of these individual skeletal muscles. So each individual skeletal muscle is wrapped by deep fascia. And this is made of, what's that right there? dense, regular connective tissue. And this is a really nice picture here because you can see the fascia. Basically, that shiny, that sheeny surface that's over the skeletal muscle is the deep fascia layer, okay, that's wrapping around and stabilizing the skeletal muscle. So it's a fibrous bag, collagen fibers here, that wrap around each skeletal muscle and also groups of muscles. Okay, and what it does is it's enclosing and it's stabilizing these skeletal muscles by doing so. Here we have a cross section of the leg. This is anterior, this is posterior, and we're looking, I believe this is an inferior view. But anyways, this here's the femur, which means that these muscles right here, these are the quadriceps, and these in back for the most part, these are the hamstrings. And what I want to point out is this fascia. Okay, so we have fascia that not only wraps individual skeletal muscles, but you can see that this fascia connects it connects other skeletal muscles together as well. Okay, and what this does is it allows different muscle groups to act as functional systems. It allows these muscle groups to work together instead of individually, because the force that's transmitted between them is all transmitted between this fascia. And you can read about this. This has to do with myofascial therapy and treating your fascia correctly. All right. So, skeletal muscles connect to bone, cartilage, or to fascia by something called tendons. And what tendons are is they're rope-like extensions of skeletal muscle connective tissue. So here we have a skeletal muscle and all these different compartments in there, and all these different compartments have connective tissue around them that I'll talk about. And what happens is that as the muscle nears the structure it's going to attach to, all of these connective tissue sheaths start to merge, and they form the tendon. So they're basically connective tissue that attaches the skeletal muscle to, in this case, a bone, but it can also be cartilage as well, or other fascia. And what the reason these tendons are important is because when a muscle contracts, when a muscle shortens, that force is exerted on the tendon, and that tendon exerts that force on the bone and can cause that bone to move. In this case, the femur's not going to move, but the bone that's attached down at the other end is going to move. When the biceps contract, when they shorten, that force, that contraction force, is transmitted to the tendon, and then the tendon transmits that force to the bone. When that works across a joint, then movement occurs. And that's what basically this is showing here. You can you read this, but here's a skeletal muscle, all of these connective tissue wrappings in there, and they all merge to form a tendon, which then connects to the bone. And something else to talk about since we're here, I guess, I talked about these mesiums. And you guys don't need to know, I'm not going to hold you really responsible for this, except that you need to know that they're connective tissue wrappings, in that they help to form the tendon and that kind of thing. But the epimysium, for instance, wraps around the skeletal muscle. That's the outer wrapping layer. But then the deep fascia is outside of that. And then we have something called a paramecium. And a paramecium is the connective tissue sheath around the fascicle. And then we have an endomysium, and that's the connective tissue sheath around the muscle cell itself. All right. So we have some modified tendons that are called aponeuroses. And what aponeuroses are is they're thick, basically flattened tendons. Not necessarily thick. Well, they could be thick, I guess. So Aponeuroses basically are flattened tendons, and they serve the same function as tendons, only in different situations. So let me point out some aponeuroses here. This is an aponeurose right there. It's a flattened tendon basically, and so this is the aponeuroses of one of the abdominal muscles, the internal abdominal oblique, and when it contracts, that contraction force is transferred to the aponeuroses, which pulls on whatever structure it's attached to. These are some other aponeuroses. These are epicranial aponeuroses on top of the head, basically flattened tendons. Okay, so skeletal muscles allow for movement. Let's talk about specifically how this occurs. So skeletal muscles attach to bones at locations called origins and insertions. And we'll use the biceps muscle as an example of this. So here's the biceps muscle. And like I said, skeletal muscles attach to bones at origins and insertions. So for the bicep, the origin is up here. It has two origins. One's the coracoid process. So there's the coracoid process of the scapula, and there you can see that the bicep is attached to that via this tendon. And then it has another origin, and that's right above the glenoid cavity right there. And again, it attaches to that origin via a tendon. The point, though, being is that these are the origins of the bicep muscle. So skeletal muscles attach to bones at locations called origins and also insertions. And this is the insertion point down there. It's on the radius, in particular a bone marking called the radial tuberosity. So what happens here, and I'll just go ahead and read this. As skeletal muscles contract or shorten, so this skeletal muscle contracts or shortens, it creates force which pulls on the origins and the insertions. So when this contracts, these tendons of the skeletal muscle pull on the origins and the insertions. And this next part's important. The origin, however, remains stationary. So when you contract the bicep, the scapula, where these origins are at, is going to remain stationary. And instead, the insertion point is going to move. So the biceps contracts, it shortens. The force is transmitted to the scapula, to the origin, but the origin doesn't move. Instead, that force is also transmitted to the radius, and what happens when it contracts is the insertion point moves towards the origin. So the insertion point moves towards the origin, and that's what gives you, in this particular case, elbow flexion. And again, it needs to occur across a joint for this movement to occur. Okay, let's talk about some muscle classification. Muscles can be classified into three functional groups, three groups of muscles that do different things. One of those is called the prime movers, also called the agonists or the leaders. These are the muscles that have the major responsibility for producing a specific movement. So for instance, the biceps brachii are the prime mover of elbow flexion. They're the muscles that are primarily responsible for producing elbow flexion. Then you have something called the antagonists, or against the leaders. These are muscles that oppose or reverse a particular movement. And antagonists are located on the opposite side of a bone as the agonist. So here we have the elbow joint, and the prime mover here of elbow flexion is the bicep, which makes the tricep antagonist to this movement. So when the prime mover is active, when the bicep here is active, what the antagonist is going to do is it's either going to relax and stretch, or it's going to give a slight bit of contraction. And what both of these do, why it's important, is it provides some resistance to the prime mover here. It provides some resistance, and what that does is it ensures the smoothness of the agonist motion. So the antagonist smooths out the motion of the agonist. Then we have other types of muscles called fixators. And the fixators that we'll use in this example are the levator scapula and the rhomboid major right there. Okay. So those are the fixators. Now here is the deltoid. And the origin for the deltoid is on the scapula, and the insertion point is down here on the humerus. When the deltoid contracts, the origin remains stationary, but the insertion point moves. So the humerus moves up, and that causes arm abduction. But here's a question for you. You guys know that the scapula doesn't have a bony joint with the axial skeleton. Instead, it's attached to the axial skeleton by skeletal muscles. So how is it that the scapula remains stationary when the deltoid is pulling on it? Okay, and that's where fixators come into play. So what the fixator muscles do is they contract and they stabilize the origin. So the levator scapula and the rhomboid major contract, and that stabilizes the origin, which allows it to remain stationary and allows the deltoid to do its particular movement. These are also called synergists. Okay. And then we'll end up with talking about how we name skeletal muscles, and this is for the lab only, but to help you decipher some of these daunting skeletal muscle names. This should help you out. But we can name muscles based on location. Okay, the bone or body region that it's associated with. This is the temporalis muscle there. Why is that the temporalis? Because it's on top of the temporal bone. These are the external intercostals. We're talking about these in Bio 242 because they're involved in breathing. But where do we find the external intercostals? We find them in between the ribs. We can name them based on shape. Okay, a deltoid means having a triangle shape, so the deltoid has a roughly triangular shape. Trapezius has a trapezoid shape, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then serratus, has a sawtooth shape. So these all shape can also be used to name a skeletal muscle. We can name these based on size, and in particular, relative size. So let's see. These are some terms that relate to size. Maximus means biggest. Magnus means big. Medius in the middle. Minor means smaller. And an example of this is with the glutes, with the butt muscles, basically, the gluteus muscles. So here's the gluteus maximus, which is the... Here's the gluteus maximus, which is the biggest of the gluteal muscles, but we also have the gluteus medius. There's the gluteus medius underneath that, and that's in the middle with regards to size. And then we have the gluteus minimus, which is the smallest. So we can name these based on size. And these are some descriptive terms that deal with size, but these deal with length instead of volume, I guess. Muscle fiber direction. We can name muscles based on the direction the muscle fibers run in. And this is relative, the direction they run in is relative to the midline here. The abdominal muscles are a good example of this. Rectus means straight or parallel. So the rectus abdominis, those fascicles are running straight or parallel to the midline. Use a different color there. They're running straight or parallel to the midline. Transversus. This means at a right angle to the axis. So the transversus abdominis, the deepest of the abdominal muscles down there, runs at a 90-degree angle to this midline. And then oblique means angles that are not right angles and not parallel. And the internal and external abdominal obliques, those muscle fibers run at angles that are not 90 degrees or not parallel to the midline. We can name skeletal muscles based on the number of organs. We've been looking at the bicep muscle. The reason it's called bicep is because it has two origins. There's an origin, and there's an origin there. The triceps are called the triceps because they have three origins. Quadriceps because they have four origins. We can name them based on the action. The flexor carpi radialis. Why is that called the flexor? Because it's involved in wrist flexion. We can name them based on attachment location. So the points of origin and insertion. And if they're named like this, then we name the origin first. So there's a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid. Sterno refers to the sternum, right there. Cleido refers to the clavicle. And then mastoid, in this particular instance, is referring to the mastoid process up there on the temporal bone. So why is it called the sternocleidomastoid? That's because the origins for this muscle are on the sternum and on the clavicle. And you can see that here. This is the sternocleidomastoid there, the origin on the sternum and on the clavicle. And then its insertion is on the mastoid process right there. So when this muscle contracts, again, the origin remains stationary and the insertion moves, so this causes lateral flexion of the neck. And then lastly, we can get all crazy and combine several of these criteria. For instance, the extensor carpi radialis longus. Extensor, what does that mean? It means it's involved in extension. Extension of what? Of the wrist. Radialis refers to the fact that it's running along the radius. And longus refers to the fact that there are other extensor carpi radialis muscles and that this is just the longest one. All right, that's some good stuff for you guys to chew on and process. So we'll see you guys on Tuesday.